Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the next ePrime live stream. Today we're going to be doing a flanker task. So a flanker task is a response inhibition task to which participants are going to see arrows on the screen. They're going to be told if you see an arrow facing the right to push the number 2 button on the keyboard. If you see an arrow facing the left, push the number 1 on the keyboard. Now the tricky part is, or the flanker part of it, is you're going to see stimuli on either side of the critical stimuli. Those other stimuli are going to be arrows either pointed in the same direction or the opposite direction as the critical stimuli. And the response inhibition part comes in where the arrows are pointed in the opposite direction as the critical stimuli. So generally speaking, we're going to expect participants to respond slower or less accurately, or both, to instances where the critical stimuli is facing the opposite direction of the flanking stimuli. So that's what we're going to be making in ePrime today. If you have ePrime 3 and you have access to our experiment library, this is going to look very familiar. We're actually using we're actually going to end up using the same stimuli, and it's going to be kind of the same task as the flanker experiment that we have on our experiment library. So it's going to be kind of a companion to what we already have on there. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to start with a blank eStudio file. So out of my experiment templates here, we'll go ahead and select blank and click OK. It takes a second to load. As you notice, we are using ePrime 3. There are a few new features that we will be demonstrating today. But aside from that, we're not going to be relying too heavy on some of the ePrime features. If you guys have any questions or comments or would like to see how some of the ePrime 3 features would be implemented into this task, go ahead and give me a comment during the live stream there. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and keep going. So now that I have my blank ePrime open, the first thing I want to do is I want to make a welcome screen, just kind of welcoming to the task, just a very general sense or general screen here. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on my session proc, and the first thing I'm going to add is just a text display welcoming participants. So it's just going to be a text display object right here from my toolbox. I will drag it into my experimental timeline. And the first thing is just going to be text display 1. As I always say, the name needs to reflect the function. Since the purpose of this text display object is to welcome participants to the experiment, I'm just going to rename this welcome. Now, if I double click on it to open it, I'm going to get it in the workspace here, or I will open my text display object in the workspace. I want to just write some very simple welcoming text. So, welcome to the experiment. You will see a series of arrows. Please pay attention to the center arrow. Press space to continue. So, what this is going to do, again, it'll welcome participants to this task. It'll give them a very brief overview of exactly what we'll be doing today. So in this instance, we're going to be seeing some arrows, and to pay attention specifically to that center arrow and press space to continue. So what I need to do is just change the duration input properties of this. This is going to allow me to change how long this is on the screen and what they use to respond to this. In this instance, I want all of my responses to be made on the same device. It is very possible and very easy to make this be responded to with a mouse, with a touch screen, with a keyboard, with a Chronos, anything like that. In this experiment, since I'll be responding either with a 1 or a 2 on the keyboard, I'm going to keep everything keyboard related. So if I just click on this properties page icon in the upper left-hand corner, I just need to change the duration input tab. If you see here, there's all my text. And even though it shows up in the top center of the screen here on my slide text sub-object in the workspace, if you look here at the align vertical and align horizontal properties, you see that it's actually set to center. So when this experiment runs, it'll look a little different at runtime because it'll actually show up in the center of the screen because of these two properties. If I want it to stay there at the top of the screen, I can actually set this, my align horizontal, keep to center, but align vertical I set to top. And if I click apply and OK, that's actually going to keep that at the top of my screen whenever I run the experiment. But I want everything in the center, so I'm going to keep it all center there. I'm going to go ahead and click on the duration input tab here. I generally like participants to be able to sit on these instruction screens for as long as they need to, just so there isn't anything, there isn't like it shows up and it moves on before they actually have time to process what it says. I'd like them to read it quickly, or to read it and then process that information. So I'm going to change the duration property from 1000 milliseconds, or 1 second, to infinite. Now, if I keep this like this, what's going to happen is this window is going to show up, and E prime will never move on. That's because there's nothing to respond to, or we don't set an input mask so participants can respond to anything on this. So we'll have to change this duration, or this device's property here under the duration input tab. Specifically, we're going to add what we call an input mask in E prime. An input mask is essentially a response device that's associated specifically with any particular slide text or slide object. So go ahead and click Add. And in this instance, since I said we were going to respond with a keyboard, I'm going to go ahead and click on Keyboard. And I'll click OK. I add a keyboard there. And if you look at my instructions, it says press space to continue. So I'm going to actually change my allowable from any to space in curly brackets. This is how we denote keyboard responses using the space bar in E prime. It's just curly brackets with the word space in between them. For any special keys, they work very similar to this. If you're doing a flanker task, one of the more common response methods that you'll see are the actual arrow keys on the keyboard. Those are just denoted like this. Right arrow for right arrow, and left arrow for left arrow, and of course that curly bracket as well. But in this instance, we won't need those special keys. We're actually just going to use space, and our main task is just going to use 1 and 2 just for the sake of simplicity. As always, I'm going to change data logging from none to time audit only. I'm going to do this specifically on my instructions too, not only because I generally like having more data than necessary, just in case I ever need it later, but I do want to see if there is an instance of a participant just clicking as fast as they can through this task. And I just think that's beneficial just in case, I see that this was only on the screen for about 0.5 seconds. Of course, they didn't read this, and then they got all the rest of the task wrong. I might be able to see what might be going on that way. So I'm going to keep this at time audit only just so I can kind of get that information. And I'm going to click OK. And that's really all I need to change on my welcome screen. So I'm going to close out on my welcome screen, and the next thing I'm going to add are more specific instructions. Instructions explicitly about how to complete this task. Because right now all it says is you're going to see arrows focus on the center arrow, but it doesn't actually tell them how to respond or what they'll be doing. So I'm going to add another screen here, and it's just going to be called Trials Instruction. So I'll take a text display object, because it's just text-based instructions. I will drag it just after my welcome screen, and I will rename this to Trial Instructions. There we go. All right, I'm going to double click on that to open it in my workspace here. And I'll just type some simple instructions. There we go. So, if the middle arrow is pointing left, press 1 on the keyboard. If the middle arrow is pointing right, press 2 on the keyboard. Press space to begin. Very simple instructions, very clear, lets participants know the button mapping. They need to have their fingers on either 1 or 2, and they know that this is all I have to do for the task. And then just press space to begin. So what I'm going to do is actually the exact same edit that I made to the welcome screen. I'm actually going to change my duration input properties under the properties page here. Click on duration input. I'm going to change duration from 1000 milliseconds to infinite. And I'm going to add an input mask of a keyboard again. Change my allowable back to space. And change my data logging tab here to time audit only. Again, this is just to kind of tease out whether or not participants are just rapidly hitting space through all of my instructions. That way, if I get a lot of bad data or a participant who isn't doing particularly well in the task, I can kind of see, oh, they didn't really read the instructions very well, those kinds of things. So go ahead and click OK. Now the next thing I want to do is I want to actually make a block list. Now, for those of you new to the whole session, block, and trial structure of E prime, this is at first going to look a little silly, but once we add our critical trials and our practice trials, it'll look like it makes more sense a little later. But for now, I'm going to actually just add a list that's going to serve as as our block level of the experiment. So this is where E prime is basically going to split off into two tracks, one of which is going to be the practice trial, and the other of which is going to be the critical trials. So I'll get a list object, drag it just after trial instructions, and I will rename it from list 1 to block list. And I'm going to rename it to block list just because this is where our practice and our critical trials happen. And those are what we consider blocks in E prime, or types of trials. So if I double click on my block list here to open it, the only thing I really need to change is this procedure. So procedures are going to be just different series of tasks that participants are going to run. And like I said, in this instance, I would like one series of tasks to be practice for the experiment, and the other series just to be the critical trials. So in this instance, I'm going to make my first procedure practice, because I obviously want practice to come before the critical trials. So I will name this prac block proc, which is a bit of a tongue twister. And I get this, I got one screen that says, that procedure doesn't exist, would you like to create it? And I clicked yes, and I made my block proc. And this one says, would I like to make the default value for newly created levels, meaning does every level of that list object afterwards contain prac block proc? And I'm going to say no, because I actually want another procedure underneath that. So I'll go back into my list object, and I will change it from prac block proc. I will add one more level here, and since I didn't make it the default value for newly created levels, you'll see that this is blank, which is good. And then I'm going to actually make this one block proc. And this is before I go ahead and click this. I kind of clicked through it pretty rapidly before, but it says the procedure block proc doesn't exist. Would you like to create it? If you look over in your structure window here, you're actually going to see block proc with a yellow question mark inside it. That means that E prime doesn't know what this object is yet, but it thinks that it's going to be a procedure. And if I click yes, it's actually going to turn that. And you watch that little circle change. It'll turn it into a procedure object. And that's kind of why it hops me out of the list object back onto the procedure, because it made a new procedure. So this is the only change that I need to make to this particular list object. It's sequential selection right now, so it's going to do my practice trials before my critical trials, which is smart and which is exactly what I want. So I don't really need to make any more changes here. So the first thing I'm going to do is actually start fleshing out my practice procedure. So if I double click on it, I get another experimental timeline that looks very similar to my session proc. But if you look at where it sits on my experiment explorer here in the structure window, it actually comes below it. So the way that E prime is going to hit this whenever it runs it is it's going to open up my session proc, because this little green circle represents the beginning of my experiment. It'll go to instructions, then it'll go to trial, or to welcome, then it'll go to trial instructions, then it goes into my block list, and then it runs these procedures in the order on which they're presented in this block object, or in this list object. The first one it's going to hit is prac block proc. So now I get to run whatever I put in here. Now the purpose of the list object is kind of twofold. The main purpose of the list object is to create new procedures in E prime, as you saw with our block list. The other major purpose of the list object is to differentiate between independent variables and load all of your independent variables in these list objects. And that's exactly what we're going to be doing with the next list object that we create. I want to put all of my independent variables in there, both that are going to be used in the trial, so my stimulus objects, all of the correct responses, and any extra pieces of information that I want to keep for my data file for later. I'm also going to be putting, and that's also going to be determining the selection method for my independent variables as well. So am I going to present all of my independent variables in the exact same order all the time to every participant, or does each participant receive different versions or different mixes of each of my stimuli? So that also is handled in a list object. So to do that, I take another list object from my toolbox, and I will drag it to the very beginning of my prac block proc here. And I am just going to call this one prac trial list. For those of you following along at home, I'm actually renaming, and I know it's a bit late in the game, but I'm renaming just by clicking on it and clicking F2 because I love keyboard shortcuts. You can also rename it yourself just by clicking on it, right-clicking, and clicking rename, and as you can see, our keyboard shortcut is right there as well. So if I double-click on it to open a new Studio Structure window, it looks identical to how block list used to look, but I'm going to start beefing it up just a little bit. So the procedure this time is actually going to be called prac trial proc, since it's the practice version of our trial proc. I'll go ahead and hit enter. I would like to create it, and I would like to make it the default value for all of my newly created levels. Now, if I jump back into prac trial list, I have a few more things to add. Now, the first thing I need to add is my stimulus. Now, my stimulus is going to be identical to what is on our website. So if you have run that, it's called, I just have images called target 1, target 2, target 3, target 4, target 5, and target 6. I actually have them on a jump drive, and I will get them out right now just to show you guys. Just to show you guys the stimulus files that I'm going to be using. I'm transferring between computers on a jump drive themselves. There's also a finished version of the task. So if you guys would like to see the finished version of the task plus all of the files that I have on this jump drive, it's just going to be exactly what you see in this little folder here. Let me go ahead and plug that guy in. Comes up here. It's called Flanker. So these are all of my images that I'm going to be shown. They're my pre-rendered flankers. And then this is that flanker task file that you're going to end up seeing, that ES3 file that comes in our experiment library. So my target 1, this is my first version of the flanker. As you can see, this is that arrow pointing to the right, so participants are going to need to respond using the right key. And then these are these are flanked by what we consider neutral stimuli. There are not arrows, they are just little diamonds. So there isn't anything confounding about this picture or this picture. It is just a right and left arrow pointing at neutral stimuli. However, if we go on to my target3.bmp, what actually is going to happen here is you're going to see a left arrow flanked by right arrows. So this one is going to be that inhibition response. So since the flanker arrows are pointing off to the right, the participant is immediately going to want to press 2 in order to respond to a right arrow. But if you look at the critical arrow in the middle, it's pointing to the left. And conversely, with this one here, my target 6. And then if you look in the middle, targets 5 and targets 4 are all congruent arrows. So they're all pointing to the right, they're all pointing to the left. So these should be the ones that participants respond to the fastest. And these opposite arrows here, so a target arrow pointing to the right with flanker arrows pointing to the left and vice versa, those are the ones that participants are going to be responding to the slowest. So since I know the names of my images and I have them already pre-made, just target 1.bmp, target 2, target 3, target 4, target 5, and target 6, I want to make a stimulus column that actually references these images. So if I click on Add Attribute here, I am going to call this attribute Stimulus and hit Add. And my first one is obviously going to be target1.bmp. Now what I could do at this point is I could add a whole bunch of rows that house all of my different targets, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. But I kind of like doing this row by row, because the way that E' handles a trial in E', or one set of stimuli, is E' reads that row by row. So one row stands for one trial. So I want to make sure I have one trial completely filled out first before I go ahead and start adding the rest. So since I have a stimulus there, each stimulus has an associated correct answer. So if I click on Add Attribute, I will do correct answer as the name for this attribute. And if I open up my target 1 image here, you'll notice that the arrow is pointing to the right. So the correct answer in this instance is going to be the 2 key on the keyboard. So my correct answer is going to change from question mark, which is its default, to 2. I'm going to add another attribute here, and it's going to be called correct. And the correct column is going to determine whether or not the correct arrow was pointing to the right or to the left. And in this instance, it was pointing to the right. And finally, I want one more attribute. This isn't going to be used during the task, just like my correct answer isn't. The only things that are going to be used during the actual task itself are the stimulus, because that obviously needs to vary between trials, and the correct answer, because again, that needs to vary between trials. The correct column, and then this next column I'm going to make called congruency, are actually going to be used primarily for my data file. So these data files here are going to be separated into whether participants responded correctly to target 1 and what the correct answer was and those kinds of things. But my data analysis is dependent on whether the trial was congruent, whether it was neutral, whether the response was right, whether it was left, those kinds of things. That's really where my data analysis is going to come in, and this is going to save me a lot of post-processing to put this information in the data file right away. So I'm going to change the name of this attribute to congruency, and I'm going to hit add. And then the congruency for this one, actually, if I look at this, is neutral. It's not congruent or incongruent, it's just flanked by these neutral diamonds here. So I'm going to change congruency here to neutral. So now that I have that trial, I want to move on to my next one. Now what I can do here, since I already have this information, is I can actually copy it by highlighting this entire row and clicking Control-C, clicking on my stimulus, and clicking Control-V. And it automatically pastes the contents of that top row into the bottom row. Now what I need to do, obviously, is change some of the information here. So in this instance, I'm now talking about my target 2. So some things need to change. Obviously, the file name needs to change from target1.bmp to target2.bmp. My correct answer is going to be 1, and correct in this instance is going to be left, since it's actually facing left. But my congruency, if you notice, is still going to remain the same. It's still going to be neutral. And then that's all I need to do to change this row here. So I'll go ahead and add a few more. I'm actually going to add one for each and every one of my stimuli. So I have 2, that means I need 4 more. So instead of adding them each individually, I'm going to go ahead and add multiple levels. And I want to add 4 more levels because this is going to handle targets 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So the next thing I want to do is I want to copy this row. This is going to be target 3. I will need to pop open my target 3 here. That one is pointing to the left, so there's a correct answer of 1, and it is an incongruent trial. The correct answer of 1, correct is left, and is incongruent. And we'll take a look at target 4. Target 4 is pointing to the right, and it's a congruent trial. So target 4, pointing to the right, and it is a congruent. We'll go ahead and take a look at target 5. Target 5 is pointing to the left, and it's congruent. So 1 for left, correct is left, and there's another congruent. And then by process of elimination, whoops, target 6. Target 6 has to be incongruent and pointing to the right. So pointing to the right is 2, right, and incongruent. And as you can see, E prime has a little answer recommendation there. When you start to type the value or a value that's similar to a previous cell, it'll start to try to fill it in for you. It's just nice like that. So what I want to do now that I have my stimulus, correct answer, correct, and congruency, all of my attributes already set, what I want to do is I want to change the selection method. It's currently set to sequential. I want to set it to random. So to do that, I'll click on Properties page up here, click on the Selection tab, and change my order from sequential to random. I recommend random over random with replacement, because random with replacement, what will happen is once E prime makes a selection from this list object, it actually adds that list object back into the pool of potential next responses or potential next stimuli. So I could, in essence, randomly get target 3.bmp 6 times in a row, and that falls under E prime's random with replacement. Random selection makes sure that participants see all of these. Now, since I don't think that one presentation of all of these stimuli is good enough, I want these to show up twice. I want a 12 trial practice round instead of just 6. So in case, let's say they get, target 3.bmp incorrect, I want to give them an opportunity to see this a couple of times. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm actually going to do something here. I'm going to change the weight from 1 to 2. Now what this does is this actually adds 2 instances of this row into E prime's randomization selection. So E prime has the opportunity to present this particular row twice. Now this is in contrast to another way that we could have done this, which is by adding another 6 rows and copying and pasting the contents of this here. So this is going to look identical to the next change that I'm doing. If you're following along at home, you totally don't need to do this. This is just showing you that there are kind of two ways to go about this. So if I set it to this, I end up getting 12 samples, and I get 2 instances of each sample. So E prime's going to sample this exactly how I want it to. But if I delete these and just change the weight column from 1 to 2 for each one of my cells here, it's going to be exactly the same for E prime in the long run. Each of these cells is now going to be sampled 2 times. Now, if you're doing something like this where you're just setting the weight to 2, it's not going to make that big of a difference in the long run. It's actually going to be pretty similar, and their list object isn't going to grow as exponentially as it possibly could. But wait until we get to the trial list. That one's going to be a little different, and it'll become a little more apparent why changing the weight's going to be the better option here. But for now, that's all we need for our practice trial list. I'm going to go ahead and close out of all of these windows here. As you can notice, they're kind of docked at the top here. I think that's really cool. I like that bar to be prime 3. But I don't really need to have them all at the top of the window here, and I don't like this to get cluttered. So I'm actually going to click Window, and I'm going to click Close All, and it will close all of them. So I'm going to go ahead and double click on my practice trial proc, because that's what I want to start editing next. Pretty common for E prime samples, I want to show a fixation in the middle of the screen to have participants' eyes kind of hone in on the middle, which is where my stimulus is going to show up. So I'll get a text display object, drag it to the very front of my practice trial proc, and I will change the name of text display 1 to fixation, and hit enter. Go ahead and double click on it to open up in eStudio's workspace. And then my fixation is obviously just going to be a plus sign in the middle of the screen. I said obviously because that's the fixation that we use in all of these YouTube live streams. If you're familiar with this is going to look the same throughout almost every experiment that we do. And this is how it's set up in the experiment library as well. If I click on the duration or the properties page here and go to the duration input tab, I'm going to change the duration of this from 1000 to 500 milliseconds. Just because I like it only for 5,000 milliseconds on the screen. I think 1 second's a little long. And I'm going to change data logging to time audit only, again, just because I'd rather have more data than necessary to comb through later than wishing I had logged something that I didn't. What's important here, actually, is going to be my pre-release value. Now, the point of pre-release is that it actually stops E prime from processing this object in the background and allows E prime to process and load the next object before it runs. I want this because my next object is going to be an image, and images take a little bit of time in order for E prime to run. Me doing this and setting pre-release the same as duration ends up shortening the possible onset delay that I have for my next object in the experimental timeline. It's going to result in better timing, greater millisecond accuracy, and precision when presenting my objects on the screen. I'm going to go ahead and click OK to save these changes. Since I did data logging, it takes a little bit of time to load, but that's okay. And then I'll double click on my prac trial proc. So now the next object that I want to make is going to be my stimulus object, or Stim Display in this instance. This is what's going to be used to display the flanker to the participants. This is also what's going to be used for participants to respond. So I'll take a slide object, and I'll drag it and drop it from my toolbox. And I will rename slide 1 to Stim Display, and hit enter. Double click on it to open it in my workspace. And now what I want to do is I want to add those images that I set in my prac trial list. So I want to go ahead and click on slide image, and I want to drop it right there. This is where the images are going to be displayed whenever participants run this task. Now I want it to be in the center of the screen just like my fixation object. So I can put it anywhere right now, but I'll have to change that property a little later. So first, let's go ahead and open up these properties, and I'll show you something that's really easy to miss when you're editing images in eStudio. So if I go ahead and open up these image properties, what I want to do is I want to put the file name of my image in here. Doing this is going to be just as easy as adding an attribute reference to my stimulus object here. So I open up these properties page and just do stimulus in square brackets. This is actually going to reference that stimulus property. But if you notice, I haven't actually saved my experiment yet. So E prime doesn't know where to draw these images from, because the way that E prime loads images is if you just have the file name like I do in my prac trial list here under my stimulus attribute. If I just have the image name, E prime is going to look in the exact same folder as the ES2 file is saved in. But since I haven't saved it anywhere, if I go to click on this Open Images, ePrime's just going to try to open from the My Experiments folder by default, because that's ePrime's like default image location. But it's not actually going to try to pull from where this file is saved because it's not saved anywhere. So before loading any of these images into ePrime at all, I recommend saving your experiment. So I'm going to go ahead and click Cancel there. I'll click File and click Save. And I'm actually going to put this right here. I'm going to make a new folder. Or I'm not going to make a new folder. I'm actually just going to keep it here. And I'm just going to call this one Flanker Task. And hit Enter. And if you can notice, those are all my other live stream videos right there. So the other thing that I want is I want to actually put my images in the same folder as my ES2 or ES3 file. The reason I want that there is because that allows me to reference my images just by putting the image name right there, instead of having to put a pathway to that image. This also helps ePrime to load the images a little faster. So what I want to do is I want to take all of my images, and then I want to open up a new instance of File Explorer, go to My Experiments. This is in the 3.0 folder, and I'm going to actually put all of my images in the same place as my Flanker task. This looks a little messy right now just because this is where all of my live streams end up going, all of the experiments I created. But in this instance, this is where my Flanker task is, so this is where my files are. So I'll X out of that. And now if I save my experiment one more time and open up this, I'm now going to see my Flanker images as possible selections. Now since I'm just going to be referencing this with an attribute reference, I don't actually need to put or hard code the name of my target images in here. But what I want to do is I want to hard code at least one of them in right now, just to see what it looks like in the slide text slide image subobject. So if I click Apply and OK, this is going to look really silly. Now my image looks gigantic in this little tiny text display here, or image display here. And if I resize it, it's going to look really big on the screen. What I can do is if I want my image to retain this exact size, and I only want it to be this big, but I don't want it to be cut off on the sides here, I can actually click on it, click on the Properties page, and I'll have to change this stretch property from no to yes. And what you saw it do was it actually took the image and it forced it to fit the size of the slide image subobject. And if I expand this, you can see that the images will contort based on this property, this stretch property. So that's why I like previewing one image before I actually load it with an attribute reference. A, just to make sure that the aspect ratio stays the same in the images and I'm not distorting them when I'm presenting them to participants. And B, I want to make sure that they actually fit within the confines of the area in which I'm presenting them. You also have the option in ePrime to change this stretch mode property from both to, let's say, left and right, so ePrime only stretches it along one axis, which in this instance actually ends up making it look much better even at different aspect ratios. And you can change it to up-down, where it'll only stretch it along the top and bottom parts of this, which may end up making it be cut off, which is completely okay with those properties. So this isn't ideal. What is ideal in this instance for this particular set of images is the stretch mode being set to left-right. And this is going to differ from, between image, or from image to image. All of my images are exactly the same, or at least extremely identical, made using the same program, made using the same editor, and all of the images that are on here are the same size and relative same shape. So left-right is going to work for me. It may not work for you. You may need to use stretch mode set to both. You may not need to stretch at all. It's actually completely dependent on the images that you're using. So I like the way that looks, so I'm going to go back into the properties page there. I'm going to change my frame from 51%, 52%, so close to center, and actually change them to center. So close. And I'm going to go back to the General tab here, and I'm going to change my file name from target1, which was just used for preview, to my actual attribute reference of stimulus. That way now, I'm going to click OK, and you're going to see that ePrime, when it runs, actually loads target 1, target 2, target 3, target 4, target 5, and target 6 2 times in a row, and it's all going to be displayed in there. Now, if you notice the temporary image here, or ePrime's default image, looks a little blocky and a little stretched and a little cut off. That's because we set stretch mode DS and stretch TS and stretch mode to left and right. Had we not set that, it would look a lot nice and neat, or a lot nicer and neater in the center of the screen there. But this is all going to turn out well whenever we run it, so I don't want to change that. Now there's another property we need to change here, and that is this duration input tab again on the properties page. My duration in this instance is going to be set to 5,000 milliseconds, since I want participants to have some time to respond, but not all the time they need. I want to change my data logging to standard, because in this instance I want to see not only how long it took them to respond and how long this was on the screen, but I want to see what they responded. And I'm going to add a keyboard input mask. Now I'm going to change my allowable here from any to 1 and 2, since they're just pressing either 1 or 2 on the keyboard. And I'm going to change my correct property to that correct answer attribute that I made in my practice trial list. I'll keep my time limit as same as duration. The time limit property does differ from the duration property in a very important way. The time limit property is how long participants have to respond to this object. The duration property is how long it stays on the screen. So if, for instance, I want participants to respond to this object well after it's gone from the screen, I can change my time limit to something like 10,000, and then they still have 5,000 milliseconds after this leaves the screen to respond to it. But in this instance, I'm going to keep it as same as duration. And I'm going to keep my end action here set to terminate, and all end action means is whenever participants make a response on the keyboard, what happens. I can set it to terminate, and it'll immediately move on to the next object in the experimental timeline, or I can set it to none, which means if they make a response, regardless of whether or not they made a response, this object will stay on the screen for the entirety of its duration. I don't necessarily want that for this paradigm, so I'm just going to keep it to same as duration. And click OK. So that's all the changes I need to make to the stimulus object. Now, since this is practice trials, I want participants to know if they've responded correctly or incorrectly and get that feedback. It's pretty easy to do using a feedback display object in E', so that's just what I'm going to add. So I'll take a feedback display here, drag it and drop it just after my Stim display. I'm going to rename this to feedback and hit enter. Now my feedback object is going to be pretty standard. I don't really need to change anything. Just know that you can. This at RT seconds response time and at ACC.mean, these are something called feedback macros. We have a couple of them set, and if you'd like to learn more about that, please let me know. I'll be happy to go into that. But these are just referencing how long it took them to respond and their accuracy. Since for this task, RT and ACC are important, or response time and accuracy are important, I'm going to keep those statistics on the screen for both correct and incorrect, and if they didn't respond, it'll say no response detected. So the only thing I need to change about this feedback object is this input object name. And all this means is that you have to point E' at the object to which participants are responding. In this instance, it's going to be Stim Display 1. So I will click on Stim Display 1 as my input object name, click Apply, and click OK. And that's all I need. Now I have my feedback done. So now that I have this is actually all I need for my practice trial list. Now what I recommend doing, since I have this small portion of my task already completed, I want to run it to make sure that it actually works the way I say it works, and that there isn't any errors or my images show up correctly, they're sized correctly, those kinds of things. One way to troubleshoot a task is to just click the run button, run it as a normal participant would, respond as you would, and just see if this looks good. Another way is to do this windowed mode property. Windowed mode, or this test manager with windowed mode, can be accessed either by clicking windowed mode here, or by clicking E1 test and making sure this run the experiment in windowed mode property is checked. It's the same dialog, just two ways to get to it, one of which automatically checks this property, the other which doesn't. Now, I'm going to run all of my objects here, because if you look here, each object has a little check mark, which means that it has an option of not running during my instructions here. I'm going to run all of these objects just to make sure that it looks good, but I am going to change the clock scale up to 4 times normal speed, and I'm going to enable auto response. I just want to see if everything looks good in this, in this part of the experiment. So I'm going to go ahead and click test. As you can see, I now have this run experiment window that shows up in the back. All of my data that's being logged is going to show up under this context portion here. So it'll be important for me to keep track of that. I'm going to go ahead and click 1 and 1 for my subject and session and run it. Now E' is auto-responding for me. But if I look, this is showing up exactly how I want it to. My feedback display is showing up, my stimulus is showing up, and if I look, I can actually pause my experiment in the middle of it, and it's just in the middle of one of the trials. I might get a little warning here. It says auto response generates invalid data, do not use for research. Obviously, I don't want that. But what I can do is I can actually look at some of the statistics that I'm gathering right now. So this trial in particular is an incongruent trial, and I know that just A, by looking at it, and B, by this telling me it's an incongruent trial. My correct is right. Obviously, that is correct. So it looks like my data is being logged exactly the way I want it to. And in this instance, I can take a look at my RT value, my RT response, or my RT time. The stimulus that's being showed right now is target 6, and all of this data that I want to see. Now what I can do is just step the experiment to the next level in the list object, or I can resume it, or if I really want to, exit or abort the experiment. But I'm going to go ahead and resume it. Luckily, I stopped it on the last trial there. It'll say this, which means end sub just means it's done with the experiment. I go ahead and click exit, and boom. Everything looked good when I ran it. And if I really want to, I can pop open my data file here just by clicking on the EDAT3 version of the file there. And I can just make sure everything looks good right off the bat. That way, I know that everything's being logged correctly and that whenever I get to my critical trials, I just need to format them exactly this way. I would definitely recommend doing this anytime you're making an experiment, just to verify that A, you're getting the data that you're logging right off the bat, you don't have this gigantic experiment that you need to troubleshoot small parts of, and it just makes scaling the experiment up like we're going to do very soon a lot easier. So I'm actually going to close all of these windows here because I don't need any of this up right now. And I'm going to open up my block proc because now that I have my practice proc, I need my actual block proc. The first thing I want is I want my instructions to show up again one more time. So I'm going to take my trial instructions, I'm going to click copy, and in my block proc here, I'm actually going to click paste. Now whenever you paste an object in ePrime, it auto numbers it to just trial instructions 1, or to whatever object is named with a 1 at the end, just to let you know that it's a new instance of the object. So any edits that I make to this version of the object, so press space to begin, I can do press escape or something to begin, won't actually change in the other version of the object. So this trial instructions doesn't change at all because I changed trial instructions 1. But I do want to change the name. I don't really like it. I'm going to change it from trial instructions to just task instructions. And I'm going to hit enter here. As you can see, it changed on the top there, it changed there, and it changed in the property window there, which is really nice. The only thing I want to change about this, though, since the bulk of the text is going to remain correct regardless of the practice and the critical task, is I just want to thank participants for completing the practice. Thank you very much for completing the practice portion of this task. Next, we will move on to the critical trials. Oops. That one. Remember. There. So now I just want to restate the instructions. So remember, and then keep my text there, and then just thank them and tell them we're moving on to the critical trials. And I will put that in my block proc just before my actual trial list. So let's jump back into the block proc here. And now I want to make a copy of this prac trial list. I'm going to do this because this contains all of my data and all of my independent variables already set. It's going to save me a lot of time from having to actually type all of this out again. So I'm actually going to click on my practice trials list here, right click, click copy, and then in my block proc here, I'm going to right click and click paste. It says the object you're pasting contains child objects. Those child objects in this instance is this procedure and all of the objects underneath. It's considered a parent-child relationship in ePrime because the list object is essentially what contains the trial. So in this instance, it says, would you like to paste all the child objects? I'm going to say no. So what that does is it actually makes a procedure here called prac trial proc and references all of my objects back here. Now this is something that I'm going to want to change because I don't want feedback on my critical trials. I just want feedback on my practice portion. So I'm going to have to change a few things about that, and I'll show you how to do that. It's pretty easy. But for task instructions, if you notice, since I pasted it, it automatically pastes as the leftmost object in the experimental timeline. It's easy to change. All you do is just take the task instructions text display object, drag it, and drop it to just before the task trial list, or prac trial list 1. As you can see, now my instructions come before the task instead of after. So I'm going to change prac trial list 1. I'm going to rename it to just trial list and hit enter. And I'm going to double click on it to open it. Now the first thing I'd mention that was wrong with this is that it's referencing prac trial proc 1. Now while I want to maintain that fixation and stim display that I worked so hard to make, I don't want to keep that feedback object. But if I keep this as prac trial proc, it's going to have to maintain that feedback, or I'm going to delete it from both places. So what I want to do is actually highlight this entire row here by clicking on the procedure button and just deleting it. And if you notice, I didn't put anything in my unreferenced objects because I'm not completely deleting them. They're still up here. I'm just deleting that reference to them. So now I need to make a new procedure just called trial proc. And hit enter. Again, would I like to create it? Yes. And all I want to do is add this as the procedure for each one of these columns. Or each one of these rows, sorry. Now earlier I had mentioned that when I was making my prac trial list and I was expanding the number of trials from 6 to 12 by changing the weight to 2, that it didn't really matter whether or not I had the weight set to 2 or I had 2 instances of each of my rows, and you can see that here. And I told you it's going to really matter in my trial list. Well, what I want to do is I actually want to present participants with 20 instances of each one of these trials. Now this is when it really makes a difference because, as you can tell, this is going to grow exponentially if I sit here and just add a new row for every single trial that I want to run. It's going to make this list look gigantic, and it's going to be a lot sloppier and a lot harder to look at and a lot harder to edit. So say, for instance, if I have that many instances of target 1, let's say I accidentally have a typo and I spell target like that in like the 15th instance of target 1. That's going to be really hard to find because you have so many instances of this word over and over and over and over again, so it'll be difficult to find and troubleshoot later. So this way, it keeps it all nice and contained. So now all I have to do is change my weight from 2 to 20. And I'll make that apply to all of my rows here. So now I have 120 samples. One cycle equals 100 samples, or one cycle is 120 samples, and it's all set to random selection. So that's really all I need. So now all I have to do is I have to build up my trial proc here using the components that I already made in my practice trial procedure. And that just consists honestly of fixation, which I take from my practice trial procedure, drag and drop into my trial proc. So now it's the same object, just referenced 2 places. And Stim Display, just dragged and dropped into my trial proc. And that's all I need. Now I have my practice block and my critical block already made. And I'm still referencing pictures. My pictures all show up randomly, and I have literally 10 times as many trials in my trial list as I do in my practice trial list. So the only thing I really need to add now is just a goodbye object. Just something thanking participants for running the experiment, as is my way. So if I jump up to my session proc here, if I look at welcome, trial instructions, and block list, the last thing I need to add then is goodbye. Let's go ahead and take my text display object. I'll drag it and drop it. And I will change text display 1 to goodbye. And I'm just going to thank participants quickly. Just thank you very much for completing this task. And I'm going to go ahead and change my duration input properties. I'll just keep this up on the screen for 2000 milliseconds and change data logging to time audit only. And that's all I need to do. So now that I've made my actual critical trials, I want to test them. But if you notice, if I sit here and try to test all of these with the same properties that I did before, it's going to take a long time to test all of these. So if I just click windowed mode and click run, I have to run through all of my practice trials, and then I have to run through all 120 samples of my trial list here to make sure that they all run correctly. Now, if you notice, the actual flanker tasks or the Stim Display object showed up pretty, for a decent amount of time. I can actually change those properties of that auto response feature that I have, especially if I just want to run through just to make sure that there are no runtime errors. So what I would do here is I would double click on my experiment object at the top of the window, click on devices, and double click on this keyboard device. You're going to notice a tab here called auto response. Keyboard is actually the only device in ePrime that's capable of auto response. So for instance, you won't see this on the mouse properties. You won't see it on the button properties. You won't see it if I add a Chronos here. You won't see auto response as a Chronos property. It's only for the keyboard. So I'm going to click on auto response, and there's a couple of things that I want to change. So first, this response window, it says for each input mask, begin the response between 25% and 75% of the input mask's time limit. This is what makes these objects appear so long whenever they were showing up when I was running at 4 times the normal speed. That's because ePrime was trying to set it for a duration of up to 5,000 milliseconds. I want to change this. I'm actually going to change this from 5% to 10% of the input mask's total time limit. That way, when I run this, you're actually going to see those flanker objects that are showing up on Stim Display much, much, much faster. And then when time limit is set to infinite or end of procedure, treat the time limit as. In this instance, it changes it to 1,000 milliseconds. I'm actually just going to change it to 500 milliseconds, just so it responds a little faster. And then when I was running, you notice that ePrime was getting a mix of correct and incorrect responses. Since I'm testing the feedback display object here, I actually did want 80%, so I would get a mix of correct and incorrect responses. Know that this 80% here isn't an exact number in ePrime though. ePrime's going to try its hardest to hit this 80%, and it definitely will try as hard as it can, but if you don't have very many trials, it may only hit 50, it may hit a little more than 50, it might hit 75, it might hit 100. It's just ePrime making a solid attempt at hitting 80%. And then choices, when any is specified for allowable, treat the allowable property as, and this is where I could put space if I really wanted. I don't really have any set anywhere in my experiment, but I could put this as space. Otherwise, ePrime will literally press any key on the keyboard. You might see, a percentage sign, you might see a dollar sign, you might see an ampersand. They might show up in the response property. So I do like to set this to something more standardized like space. And then this allows me to change, if I have max count, how many responses should be made to that max count. Should I always do 100% of the max count? Should I never hit the max count of an object? This is just helping the ePrime specify that. And then how long do I have in between each response of a multiple response? This instance 30, I don't have any real instances of multiple responses, so I'm not going to worry about it. So now if I click apply and OK, with all of those changed properties, I'm going to go ahead and open up my windowed mode here to test my experiment, but I'm going to change a few things. First, I don't actually want to run my welcome and instructions screen. I've already run those. I know that they work fine. I don't really need to test that my goodbye screen works at all. What I do want to change, though, is whether or not this prac trial list runs, because I've tested this already. I know that this works. So what I want to do is I actually want to take it from checked. If I hit I, what it's doing is it's making it interactive. So whenever it pops up, it allows me to select which level of this row I'm running. I don't even need that. I just need this not to run. So go ahead and unselect it. Now, as you saw me do a little earlier, I started unchecking these things. What you'll notice is if I uncheck them, it unchecks them from the trial list as well. Having them checked here doesn't mean that it runs in the context of this practice trial list. It just means, does this run this object at all if it's in the timeline? And in this instance, it will right here. So now whenever I run this, the first thing I should see is my task instructions. So let's go ahead and test that. And run, I'm going to have this as 2 for my subject in session. And that was very, very, very briefly, that was my task instructions. And I'm going to pause that there, and you'll notice that that was showing up much, much faster this time. So that's exactly what I wanted. I can check my data file here quickly, and just what's being output to my data file. And that all looks good. So in this instance, since I know that this works, and I've seen all of these flankers come up, and I've seen the text display, or the fixation object, and I haven't seen any feedback, and it's flashing very quickly, I know that this is working fine. I don't necessarily need to run all of them. So I'm actually going to click abort right now. And it'll exit out of the experiment for me. I'll get a runtime error saying the experiment was terminated by the user. Of course it was, I just told it to. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. And I'm going to close all my windows because that's honestly all I have for today. That was a flanker task from beginning to end. Demonstrated how to load images in ePrime, demonstrated some best practices for experiment structure, as well as testing your experiment using erun test in that windowed mode functionality. If you have any questions, please feel free to direct them at support.pscnet.com. Go ahead and submit a request that way. I'm always happy to answer any questions. If you guys would like to see any videos in the future, if you have a task that you'd like to see me make, if you'd have a specific ePrime function that you'd like me to flesh out a little more, please feel free to leave a comment. And as always, like and subscribe. We definitely need or would like more subscribers, and likes are always a good thing. So yeah, thank you guys very much for coming today. Have a good day.